Hello everyone, today we're continuing my running Suarez obsession by doing Disputation 28 on the first division of being into the absolutely infinite and the finite, and other divisions which equate to this. Section 1. Whether being is correctly divided into infinite and finite, and what divisions are equivalent to this. This is going to take the form of a series of objections, then Suarez will clarify the question, and then he will discuss the comparisons between these different divisions of being. So first, objection 1. Finite and infinite are ideas that only apply to quantity and extension. Being is not a quantity, and it is not extended, not in itself at least, therefore being is not infinite or finite. So this is pretty simple. It's just only things that are numbers or that maybe have some sort of proportion to each other, like extended things, have this quality of finite or infinite. However, being as such, the idea of being, which is common to all existing things, is definitely not included in this kind of extension or quantity, so it can't be infinite or finite. Then furthermore, the lack of boundaries can be taken in two ways. So when you think of an infinite line, it's a line which is missing at least one boundary. So when you apply this to being, you say, okay, well, being lacks boundaries, and it's okay, well, what does that mean? The lack of being can be taken in two ways. First is privatively. Privation is something which could be had by a being, maybe it should be had by a being, but it is not present there. So if you had a line and it failed to have endpoints, it would have a privation of endpoints maybe. And this is only possible for things which are apt, which are capable of having endpoints. So a line is capable of having endpoints, so it's capable of being infinite privatively. It has the privation of infinity. Then we have a case where the thing is not capable of being infinite. The color green does not have endpoints. Your immaterial soul, which is not extended in space, does not have endpoints. These aren't the kind of things which are capable of having endpoints. A line that is green might have endpoints, but the color green itself as such, as a color, does not have endpoints. And not only that, it's not really capable of having endpoints just considered as a color. It's only capable of having endpoints when it is extended, and your immaterial soul is also likewise incapable of having endpoints. It's not a physical thing, so it lacks extension. Now, what's important here is that if you say this thing, lacks endpoints, this is negative. It's not capable of having endpoints, and it also doesn't have them. But in this case, everything is infinite, because everything other than extended objects and quantity lack endpoints, so they're infinite. This is a useless idea. Okay, next we have objection 2. This is that the division of beings should not be meaningless. The division of infinite and finite applied in this way seems almost meaningless on God's side, because we have no access to these ideas about God. Therefore, etc., the division should not, exist, because it should not be meaningless. Okay. Then Suarez clarifies. So what is this question actually about? He starts by noting that all of our ideas about God are negative. What we do is we take creatures and we remove imperfections from them. And through this removal of imperfection, we come to an idea about God. So he then takes our method to be taking all of created things, all things that are created or creatable, so all possibly created things, and we take what is common to them as creatable and created, and we remove that, and this is where we're going to get our idea of infinite. So it's not an infinite quantity, and it's not an infinite extension. It's this idea of something which is beyond the boundaries of created being. It's whatever isn't common to created being. So we have the resolution of the question. It is necessary to affirm the distinction between infinite and finite being. Because of the way we're defining the terms here, there's no problem with these two objections, because the idea of infinite is just whatever is beyond created being. And because Suarez thinks there's only one uncreated being, it's whatever is other than God. Okay, so nothing other than the idea of being and the transcendentals are common to God and to creatures. So there's this idea of being is common to everything, and the transcendentals, such as unity, goodness, truth, are common to God and to creatures because they are common to everything which has being. But then there are these oppositions which are found between God and creatures. So God is uncaused, all creatures are caused, they're creatures, they're created. God is simple, whereas creatures are divided into genus and species, like animal and rational, or, having the atomic number 79, being a metal with the atomic number 79, and gold. And then God is simple, whereas creatures are composite, or, not simple. Okay, then Suarez, to illuminate us a little bit, or to give some more meat on the bones to this idea of infinite being, will compare the idea to a series of other distinctions between God and creatures, which are going to be being through itself versus being from another, necessary versus contingent, being by essence versus being by participation, and then pure act versus potential being. The first division. Being through itself versus being through another. If you exist through yourself, you just exist. If you exist through another, you have to be caused. You have to receive your existence from some other thing. Obviously, there are some beings which receive being from another. But then the difference between God and all of these other beings is that God lacks emanation. God lacks being the idea of being caused from another. God is independent from being caused in this way. Then there's the proof of the division, because we know that there are beings which have existence from another. We run into those things all the time. If every being of a species has being from another, then the species as a whole has being from another. So if every member of group X has Y property, then the conjunction of all members of X have Y property. For the species only exist in the individuals, and they have no way of receiving existence apart from what their species requires. So every member of the species requires to have a cause for their existence. Nothing can cause itself. If it could, then the species could hypothetically cause itself, but that's not the case. So the species must proceed either from something which has being of itself or being of another. If it's being from itself, then the division is proved. If it's being from another, either you will reach a first being, which receives it being from itself, or there is an infinite chain that receives being from another, from another, from another, from another. Suarez believes that an infinite chain is impossible. Therefore, there is a being which receives being from itself and not from another. Then there is a proof of the existence of a simply finite rather than infinite chain, and he has two paths to this. The first is that if the chain is infinite, then the present could never be reached. The present has been reached, therefore the chain is not infinite. So the argument for this is pretty simply that if you think about like a number. If you start counting at the number 1 and you keep going, it doesn't matter how long you count for, you'll never ever reach infinity. This is an argument which I personally think is pretty bad because it assumes that there's a first member. If you don't assume that there's a first member, then you'll realize that it had an infinite chain in the past and that there was an infinite amount of time which was covered. So you have the infinite chain in the past, and then you keep going from the next day to the next day, so you're adding to infinity. But the chain has always been infinite, it just gets larger as time goes on. Then the next argument is that a whole collection cannot be dependent unless there is a single independent being. The whole collection is dependent, therefore there must be a single independent being. So all created things are dependent on something else. They can't all be dependent without there being at least one independent being, therefore there is at least one independent being. Okay, then we have division 2. This is the division into necessary and contingent. Necessary beings have existence from themselves, and they exist in every possible world. There's an objection, which is that maybe God creates something in every possible world, so self-existence and existing in every possible world aren't reciprocal. Suarez just grants this. He says maybe that's the case. Maybe there is something God necessarily creates in every possible world. That's not really what we're worried about here. There would still be something which exists in every possible world and which exists from itself. Then he goes on to say that later we will prove that it causes everything contingently. Oh, and he also notes that as a necessary being that is self-existent, God is incapable of corruption, part of being necessary. Then we have the division between being by essence and being by participation. Being by essence describes God. He exists because of the kind of thing he is, whereas other beings only exist by participation. They only exist by being caused. This is very, very similar to being from itself and receiving being from another. Again, there can't be an infinity of beings by participation. You can refer back to the earlier argument for that. Then there can only be one necessary being, or one being by essence. And the reason for this is that everything which exists is singular, which is a premise that is very important as far as you'll see this if you watch the videos I made on his theory of individuation. Now, everything which exists is singular by nature. God exists through himself. God is self-existent, so God is singular by nature. Whatever exists by nature is singular by nature. The common nature of all possible necessary beings exists by nature, therefore it is singular by nature. Okay, then we have division 4, which is going to be the final division. This is between pure act and potential being. First, we have 3 terms. First is actuality, act. These are things which actually exist. They're there. They are the things which are right there in front of you. They actually exist. Then you have passive potency. This is the capacity an object has to be affected. This is the ability of physical things to be moved through space by another. This is the ability of angels to have ideas placed into their mind, have a different set of ideas. This is the ability of anything to be affected by another or by itself. Then you have active potency. Active potencies are not capacities to be affected, they are capacities to affect others. Now, in physical things, an active potency always corresponds to a passive potency, because to affect other things, you have to move yourself. To pick up a cup and cause the cup to do something, you have to move your hand. So your hand has to be affected at the same time the cup is. However, with immaterial things, they're capable of causing objects without changing themselves. Because there's no physical matter which is being moved in the act of causation, there's no necessity for immaterial things to have passive potencies. Even though they have active potencies, even though they're capable of changing others, they don't need to change themselves. Then Suarez has a short list of arguments for the reality of a being which is simply pure act with no passive potencies, though it's allowed to have active potencies. That doesn't bother him in the slightest. Uncreated being is necessary and self-existent, so it does not have its existence by way of being possible and then being made actual. Because of this, at least part of the necessary being is incapable of being in potentiality, or simply possibility. It is always actual. Then, uncreated being has no passive potency, for passive potency is the result of matter, and matter is not uncausable. However, the first being is uncausable, so it has no matter, and as a result, no passive potency. And then uncreated being is perfect, and passive potency signifies the ability to increase in perfection. Therefore, uncreated being has no passive potency. That last one is the one that I find convincing, though I wouldn't run the entire argument like this. Finally, there's one last argument for pure actuality. That is, as necessary, no aspect of the infinite being can fail to exist. Its whole nature is necessary. To be in potency in any way is to be capable of failing to exist. Therefore, the necessary being is not in potency in any way. Then we have an explanation of the terms of finite and infinite. So when you think of two lines and you're thinking about which one of them is longer, what you're doing is you're comparing the endpoints and you're seeing which one goes farther than the other. So Suarez believes in this idea of a hierarchy of finite beings. Some beings are better than others. It's better to be a plant than it is to be a rock, but it's better to be an animal than a plant, and it's better to be a human than a simple pig or a giraffe. There's this hierarchy of finite beings. So then Suarez thinks, well, the infinite being is the being which is unsurpassable. All of these other beings are capable of being surpassed. All of these other beings have a being which is greater than themselves. But God, as the perfect being, as the greatest possible being, is incapable of being surpassed by anything. He is the containment of all perfection. So, finite being is being whose perfection is surpassable by a member of a different kind, and infinite being is a being whose perfection is unsurpassable by anything. And then there's the responses to the objections at the beginning. Response to objection 1 is that this infinity is a kind of negation. It's not a privation, but it's a negation of imperfection, not a negation of endpoints. And then response to objection 2 is just, it isn't meaningless. The meaning has been explained in great detail. It is about some beings being unsurpassably perfect, whereas other beings are capable of being surpassed in their perfection. I hope you learned something.